Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Gray Matters podcast. I am solo today. Glenn is on extended 4th of July vacation or something like that. And so today I'm going to do what is going to be the first in a series of like tech talks where the focus is going to be a little bit more like technical strength and conditioning and training and less on coaching, leadership, etc. Most of it drawing on my own experience, looking at mistakes I've made, failures, what I've learned from those things, again, specifically like hard skills, and where I think others could potentially learn from my mistakes. And then also like tackle myths and misconceptions, current trends that I think are valuable, current trends that I think may not be valuable, so on and so forth. So today, what I want to talk about is confusing outcomes for adaptations, maybe losing emphasis on what our processes need to look like. So right now, it seems like we've moved really far to the left in kind of the microdosing and minimalism direction. And in place of like looking at what adaptations we actually want to elicit. So today I want to look at what adaptation-driven training looks like, how we know whether or not we're actually driving those adaptations and eliciting those adaptations in training. And then from a physiological standpoint, how do we know the stimulus is enough? So in terms of adaptation-driven training, I think that's probably one of the biggest shifts back towards the middle that our profession needs to make is an adaptation-driven approach to program design. When we come up in strength and conditioning, we don't really have enough experience to view things through an adaptation-driven lens when we design programs. A lot of times, like we're really just looking at what the outcome that we want is at the end of a block of training. And, other than like maximal strength, which as anyone who's been in the game long enough knows, that's probably the easiest outcome to drive, adaptation to drive. But outside of that, a lot of times I think it's a little muddier with respect to adaptations. That being said, you've got a lot of variables that you can manipulate to drive the adaptations that you want. So the way that I look at it is I organize my programming around like all 5 biomotor abilities. So speed, strength, conditioning, coordination, and range of motion. And again, whatever terminology you want to use for those things is up to you, but that's the way I look at it. So with that in mind, when I write a block of training, I'm going to look at what is the primary adaptation I want to drive, what's the secondary adaptation, what's the tertiary adaptation. So 1, 2, 3. That doesn't mean that I'm only going to address 3 out of the 5 biomotor abilities. I'm going to try to touch all 5. But I really want to drive in a more of a block periodized emphasis, 1 primary adaptation, a secondary adaptation, and a tertiary adaptation. And if one of those biomotor abilities does not fall into those three levels, I'm just not going to spend nearly as much time on that specific biomotor ability or physical quality. So the art of adaptation-driven programming isn't any different really than how you learn to design programs coming up, but you're still going to manipulate volume, intensity, volume load, density, velocity, and you're going to use those variables in different ways to elicit those levels of adaptations. And then you put monitoring systems in place so that you regularly evaluate whether those targeted adaptations that you want are actually being elicited by the training. So for example, I spent 6 years at the college level working with volleyball as my primary sport. So one of the things that I learned pretty quickly is that incoming freshmen come in with a big volume of competition and sport practice on their bodies already. So, now these kids are playing club for 7 months out of the year, maybe longer if they make, regionals or nationals. And then they're going to play school volleyball for 3 or 4 months. And then they might get, 6 to 8 weeks out of the year where they're not in competition. So we have to be very targeted in our program design to make sure that we still address all 5 biomotor abilities, but we do so in a way that doesn't take away from the primary objective 10 months out of the year, which is playing volleyball and developing technical skill, developing tactical skills. So if the adaptation is volume accumulation. So let's just say that I want to improve tendon stiffness through high intensity loading. Then my opportunities for like extended tempo eccentric work and maybe eccentric rate of force development work are going to be pretty much limited to that 6 weeks or so between the start of club and the end of school season. And other than that, the stress is going to be too high from emphasizing that specific adaptation to try to address it at any other point in the year. So have to be very intentional about how I would program those blocks of training to drive those adaptations. Maybe if I'm leading into preseason or like preschool season, for example, and I want to emphasize rate of force development, I want to get athletes off the floor faster. We're going to emphasize that again, maybe a 2 or 3 week block. The neural stress is fairly high, but the metabolic stress, eccentric stress is pretty low. So I can generally probably do a little bit higher volume of RFD work in that period of time. But that doesn't mean I neglect it once we get into preseason or in season. We'll still, touch on RFD work at various points, but not nearly as much as during a period of time where I can make that my primary emphasis. And typically what I try to do, again, kind of looking through things with a block periodization lens or through the block periodization lens, is I'm going to have that primary and secondary emphasis adaptation that I want to drive. And I'm going to focus on those things for probably 3 weeks at a time. Again, none of this is revolutionary. It's things we all do, just looking at it a little bit differently, and then kind of cycle throughout the year, again, addressing those all 5 biomotor abilities in different volumes and intensities at different times. So from there, we need to figure out if the adaptations that we want to drive are actually being elicited by the training. Just because we write, this is a speed block, a max velocity block, and design our training like it's like we want to improve max velocity, doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to improve our athlete's max velocity. So that's where monitoring comes in, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But more than anything, like we have to make sure that the stimulus is sufficient enough to drive that adaptation. When we are in undergrad XPhys, one of the principles of all of training is the SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. The key word being imposed. In other words, like the demand has to be significant enough to force the body to adapt, or the stressor has to be high enough in order to elicit a response and then an adaptation. And kind of one of the initial points that I made is that the profession is moving more towards this kind of minimalist approach based on what I believe is a misinterpretation of microdosing. But what I actually think it is under preparation or like under training. And it doesn't mean that like they're not doing anything, but I think that many athletes, especially, again, this is all observational. A lot of what I see on social media is that they are really undertrained, and the stimulus is very rarely high enough to elicit a chronic adaptation. Now, you might elicit some transient or some short-term adaptations, but then you have to apply the same stimulus over and over and over and over in order for those adaptations to appear to be chronic. But because, again, the stimulus isn't ever high enough, the adaptations really aren't chronic. So take the example of a high school soccer team. Let's just say they practice 3 times a week. They've got 2 matches, a midweek and a weekend, and then skill work, extra conditioning mixed in. I would be willing to bet that their total running volume for the week is minimum 30,000 yards. And that's a conservative estimate. And their high-speed running volume, or speeds above 4 meters per second, is probably 10 to 15% of that total running volume. So, 3,000 to 4,500 yards. And the reason that threshold is important is because above that threshold, the metabolic demand increases disproportionately, and which then increases the demand for recovery and the manipulation of volume intensity moving forward. Now, in terms of only looking at conditioning leading up to a season, there's kind of 3 schools of thought now, specifically like within soccer. You've got your old school kind of long, slow distance, your kind of evolved high intensity, only using high intensity intervals school of thought. And then you've got your all we need is sprinting school of thought. And the issue is that the sport requires all of those things. There's going to be some slow running, a pretty big volume. There's going to be some high intensity running, and there's going to be some sprinting. There's going to be some acceleration, some deceleration. So in order to expose the athlete to the demands of the sport in terms of your preparation, they need exposure to all of those things. They need a pretty good volume of low intensity work. And it doesn't have to be running or long slow distance. It can be small sided games. It can be off feet stuff. Like there's a bunch of different ways to get low intensity work. You're going to have a pretty good volume of high intensity conditioning. Again, mostly games based, but there will have to be some like structured running blocks. And then you're going to need some sprint work. And the volumes of each of those three things are going to mean you're going to need to manipulate those based on, where you are in annual plan and what your in-season training load looks like. If you only expose your athletes to one of those methods or even two, like you're still going to leave them underprepared. And, maybe they are prepared for the intensity, but not the max speed. Maybe they're prepared for the maximal speed, but they don't have a base of volume to be able to absorb all those maximal speed and high intensity efforts. Either way, you're going to increase their risk of injury because they're not prepared for the demands that are specific to the game. And, you could do the same thing on the opposite end, the dreaded overtraining syndrome. So you take the same group of athletes and you run them 20 miles a week of long, slow distance. We already know they don't eat enough. They sleep like shit. They've got school stress. They've got relationship and friend stress. They've got Snapchat stress, and they're still trying to recover between practices and matches, etc. So now you swing all the way in the other direction, and that's where overtraining becomes the concern. Interestingly enough, undertraining and overtraining often produce the same outcomes: poor performance, increased injury risk, and adaptations that are non-specific to the sport. So the sweet spot is finding the balance of volume, intensity, and velocity in terms of specifically conditioning in the case of like a high school soccer program, and then manipulate the variables as needed. So now we look at, how do we know that we're actually driving the adaptations that we're targeting? And that's where monitoring comes in. Now, the overarching point is that monitoring is not testing. So a lot of what's popular right now, again, very social media driven and even leaderboard driven to an extent, is some sort of weekly testing. Again, not defined as monitoring, and we'll talk about the differences between the two in a minute, but whether that's a counter movement jump, a fly 10, a load velocity profile, or whatever, we've basically given athletes a target every week. And the expectation is that they should improve on that metric, whatever it is we're measuring, week over week. And it's not to say that those aren't useful measurements, because they are. But what happens is that emphasis on like performing well in those assessments is a perfect example of Goodhart's law. And that's, when a measurement becomes a goal, it ceases to become a good measurement. And what happens is we become very outcome oriented on those weekly assessments. And where that comes from is actually kind of a misapplication of monitoring. So athlete monitoring is taking those, whatever assessment that you want to take, whether it's a jump height on a counter movement jump, which apparently is not popular to do anymore because, everybody has force plates. So why would you just look at jump height? We all know that not everybody has force plates. Some of us have a jump mat. Some of us have a Vertex. Some of us have a plyo mat. Some of us use like an output sensor. And again, it's just a proxy measurement. It's not something that's like a hard and fast rule. And so that could be one way that we monitor. A fly 10 could be another way we monitor. Velocity on a GPS could be another way, or an estimated 1RM through a load velocity profile. All of those are good measurements, but they can't be targets, because what we need to use those as, and what monitoring from a principle standpoint is a way to assess whether or not our athletes are adapting to training and how. What we see kind of, again, like a lot of it is in social media with like things like record, rank, and publish, is that it's almost a straight line trending up. whatever the metric is that we're measuring. And what that tells me is two things. Either the training stimulus isn't actually significant enough to produce meaningful fatigue. Training should produce fatigue, whether acutely or accumulated, it's going to produce fatigue. It has to. And for the monitoring process has just become its own outcome in and of itself. Thinking about to the previous conversation on specific adaptations to impose demands, like stimulus has to be high enough to elicit an adaptation. And if it's not, what's going to happen is you're going to continue to apply that same stimulus, and you're going to, just like we talked about in that said principle conversation, the adaptations are going to be transient, and you're just going to keep applying the same stimulus over and over instead of applying enough of that stimulus to see an adaptation. And the way that's going to show itself is like if we have a 12-week mesocycle, and let's just say it's linearly periodized. I know, again, it's unrealistic, but we're just using it for the sake of this example. You've got a 4-week accumulation phase, you've got a 4-week intensification phase, and you've got a 4-week peaking phase. By week 3 of the accumulation phase, I should have accumulated enough volume to where the fatigue, the residual fatigue, is going to cause my counter movement jump numbers to go down. And they'll probably be the lowest they'll be throughout the entire year at that point, because that fatigue has caused an adaptation to occur, that stress response. And so you're going to see performance decrease, which is exactly what should happen. And then as you get into week 1, week 2, that intensification phase, guess what? As the volume decreases and intensity increases, that trend line starts to go back up. And then as intensity continues to increase, now our counter movement jump numbers in week 3, week 4, the intensification phase start to go down. That's exactly what they should do as a result of increased intensification. And then in the peaking block, which again, I know is unrealistic, you should see that number trend almost linearly upwards week over week, because that's exactly what should happen. And then at the end of that 12 weeks, if you were to just do a linear regression and look at the baseline, yeah, it's going to be a straight line up. Okay. You're going to trend upwards in that, whatever that monitoring metric is. But then when you go back and look at the graph, the actual week over week testing or assessment, it's going to be up and down, and then up. But overall, it's going to trend positively. And that's why monitoring is so important, because it's a great illustration of the fitness fatigue curve, or what the supercompensation curve. And I know people don't like that term for some reason, but that's what a supercompensation curve is. And the point is that the numbers don't always go up. There's always going to be some undulation, but overall, that baseline is going to increase over time. And that's what like long-term adaptation looks like. And that's how we know that adaptation is going to stick, because we applied the stimulus at the right intensity or volume for the correct period of time, or the right duration for that adaptation to really, really stick. So, and that's kind of like the theme of the whole conversation is, training is not about outcomes. Training sessions aren't about outcomes. They're about adaptation. And if you don't start with adaptations in mind, you don't know the stimulus to apply. If you don't know the appropriate stimulus to apply, the likelihood that you elicit adaptations that are specific to this imposed demands in the sport is pretty low. And then if you're not assessing it along the way, then it's like shooting at a moving target blindfolded, So takeaways: start with adaptations in mind, work backwards from there. Make sure that the adaptations that you want to elicit are actually specific to the sport you're working with and to the demands in the sport you're working with. And then if you're doing any type of monitoring, don't put too much emphasis on that monitoring, and don't turn it into testing. Okay. It's just an assessment of how the training is working or not working. So that's it for this one. I hope you guys found it useful, and we'll probably do some more of these in the near future. So like, subscribe, share with a colleague, send us feedback, whatever you got. All right. Catch you guys next time.